Did you ever imagine tasting soup made from a human body? For most, that thought is enough to spark nightmares. But for one woman in Italy, it was a grim reality she created with her own hands. Her name was Leonarda. To her neighbors, she was a polite, hard-working mother. But in secret, she became one of history's most disturbing killers. A woman who believed that the only way to protect her beloved son was to sacrifice others and boil their flesh into soap and even cakes. Stay with me, because this isn't just another crime story. This is a descent into superstition, curses, and a mother's twisted idea of love. And before we open her diary of blood, take a second to subscribe, because what you're about to hear is one of the darkest, most shocking stories ever told. Leonarda's tale begins long before the murders, in a world shaped by poverty, fear, and old-world superstition. Born in 1893 in Montella, a small town in southern Italy, she didn't arrive in this world with blessings, but with a curse at least. That's what she always believed. Her mother never wanted her. In fact, Leonarda claimed her mother had cursed her at birth for being the product of an unhappy, forced marriage. Whether or not that was true, Leonarda carried the weight of those words like a shadow that followed her every step. From the start, her life was marred by suffering. She was a frail child, often sick, and her mother made no attempt to hide her disdain. Abuse was common, physical, verbal, and emotional. Imagine growing up believing that you were a burden, a mistake, and above all, cursed. That belief burrowed deep into Leonarda's mind, and it became the foundation for the paranoia that ruled her adult years. As she grew older, the curse seemed to manifest itself in cruel ways. Miscarriages haunted her marriage, one after another, to the point where she became convinced that every tragedy, every loss, was proof that her mother's curse was real. And it didn't stop there. She endured the deaths of 10 of her children, some before birth, some in early childhood. 2 anni mortor. This would be devastating. But to Leonarda, it wasn't just grief. It was fate. It was proof that the curse demanded blood, and that if she didn't act, the curse would take everything she loved. So when World War II came, and her son Giuseppe, her pride, her favorite child, was drafted into the Italian army, the terror inside her reached its peak. She was consumed by the idea that he would die in battle. And unlike other mothers who prayed for their son's safety, Leonarda decided she had to act. In her mind, the curse could be broken, or at least redirected. If she gave death to others, maybe death would spare her son. It was this belief, this twisted form of protection, that set the stage for one of the most horrifying murder sprees in Italian history. But before the blood flowed, before the boiling pots filled with human flesh, there was a woman broken by grief, shackled by superstition, and desperate to rewrite the fate she thought she was given at birth. Because Leonarda Cianciulli's story doesn't begin with murder. It begins with a curse. A curse she believed could only be broken with blood. Leonarda Cianciulli's childhood was not the kind that shapes resilience or hope. It was the kind that bends a soul until it begins to crack. She grew up in a household where love was a language never spoken, where cruelty was served at the table as regularly as bread, and where superstition wove itself into every corner of daily life. Her father, already detached, provided no comfort. Her mother, Amelia, despised her from the moment she was born. To Amelia, Leonarda wasn't a child to be cherished. She was a burden, a punishment, a reminder of a marriage that should never have been. This wasn't just neglect. It was active rejection. Leonarda recalled how her mother would tell her, in cruel tones, that she was cursed. Imagine being a little girl and hearing the person meant to protect you insist that you were doomed. That darkness followed you wherever you went. Words like that don't just sting, they become chains around the mind. Growing up in southern Italy in the early 1900s meant living in a world steeped in folklore, curses, and omens. For Leonarda, these weren't harmless bedtime stories. They were reality. Her mind, fragile and impressionable, clung to them like truth. If bad luck struck, it was a curse. If tragedy fell, it was fate. And so, when she later suffered miscarriage after miscarriage, it only cemented what she already believed. She was cursed from birth. By her teenage years, Leonarda wasn't just scarred by her mother's hatred. She was haunted by dreams, nightmares of coffins, of dark figures whispering her name, of shadows swallowing her future. In her diary years later, she wrote about feeling watched by death, as though something hovered over her, waiting for the right moment to strike. These weren't just private terrors, they were the blueprint of the woman she would become. Her mental state cracked under the pressure. Twice, in her youth, Leonarda attempted suicide. 2 cries for release. 2 moments where the curse felt too heavy to carry. Both times she survived, and both times the belief grew stronger. If death wouldn't take her, then death was saving her for something else. Even as she matured, she remained desperate to escape the cage of her mother's abuse. And when she met Raffaele Ponsardi, a local man with steady work as a registry clerk, she thought she had finally found her way out. Love wasn't the main force here. Survival was. He was her chance at a new life, far away from the shadow of her mother. But Emilia had other plans. She disapproved of the marriage and cursed it with venom. She told Leonarda that if she went through with it, tragedy would follow her forever. And Leonarda, already conditioned to believe in curses, carried those words like daggers, buried deep in her heart. The marriage happened anyway, and though Raffaele was not cruel, he was distant, rigid, and offered little comfort to the woman he had chosen. For Leonarda, there was no soft place to land, no healing of old wounds. Instead, the curse seemed to coil tighter around her life. Poverty stalked them. Miscarriages shattered her, and every failure, every loss, felt like her mother's words echoing in her ears. "You are cursed." By the time she settled into adulthood, Leonarda had endured more death than most could bear. She lost 10 children, some before birth, some in infancy. Each tiny grave carved the curse deeper into her soul. The world was confirming what her mother had told her all along. She was marked, doomed, and powerless, but power was what she craved most. And as the years passed, as the world around her crumbled in the shadow of war, Leonarda began to imagine that power could be taken, that blood, offered willingly or not, could be exchanged, traded for protection, bargained with fate. The curse had followed her from childhood into adulthood, but now it was no longer just something that controlled her. It was something she would learn to fight with rituals, with superstition, and ultimately with human lives. Because for Leonarda Cianciulli, survival wasn't about escaping the curse. It was about feeding it. Loss. That single word defined Leonarda Cianciulli's adulthood more than anything else. If her childhood had been shaped by cruelty and curses, then her married life became an endless test of grief, one that carved deeper into her psyche with every passing year. At first, Leonarda had believed her escape from her mother's grasp might bring peace, but reality was far from kind. Her marriage to Raffaele Ponsardi was not abusive, but it was not tender either. He was strict, orderly, and emotionally detached. Leonarda, still desperate for love and comfort, found herself living with a man who seemed more like a guard than a partner. Their household was one of discipline rather than affection, and Leonarda's longing for warmth remained unfulfilled. But what truly broke her wasn't her husband's coldness. It was the deaths of her children. Over the years, Leonarda became pregnant 17 times. Out of those pregnancies, she miscarried 3 times. 10 of her children died in their earliest years. Imagine the weight of standing at 10 tiny graves, burying the future again and again. Each coffin wasn't just the loss of a child. It was the loss of hope, of purpose, of the chance to rewrite her cursed destiny. Only 4 of her children survived to adulthood, for small rays of light in an otherwise endless darkness. And of those 4, Giuseppe, her eldest son, became her obsession, the center of her world, the one she swore to protect, no matter the cost. Every time she looked at him, she saw the fragile thread between life and death. She had lost so many before him, and she could not lose him too. This obsession with survival was made worse by her fragile mental state. Throughout her life, Leonarda sought out fortune-tellers, psychics, and palm readers. Their words weren't entertainment for her. They were law. When a gypsy once told her, "In your right hand, I see prison. In your left, I see a criminal asylum. Leonarda carried that prophecy like a brand on her soul. She believed fate had already written her ending, and if that ending was already cursed, then why not use every method possible to fight back in the meantime? Superstition became her anchor. She clung to rituals, charms, and omens, searching for some way to cheat the tragedies that stalked her. But the more she tried, the more loss she experienced, as if fate was mocking her efforts. And so, her belief twisted into something darker. If luck could not be changed by prayers or charms, perhaps it could be bought with sacrifice. By the time the world plunged into the chaos of World War II, Leonarda's fragile grip on reality was almost gone. Italy was suffering, food was scarce, and families were torn apart by the draft. Her son Giuseppe was called to fight the one son she believed carried her entire hope of redemption. In her mind, this was the final test of the curse. Either she would lose him like all the others, or she would find a way to stop fate itself. And Leonarda decided she would not wait for the curse to strike again. If fate demanded blood, she would give it willingly. Not her son's blood, but someone else's. The curse had taken her children. Now, she would pay it back in the flesh of strangers. By the late 1930s, Leonarda Cianciulli was no longer just a grieving mother. She had become a woman possessed by a singular idea, that her son Giuseppe must survive at any cost, every ounce of her being revolved around that mission. For years, she had tried charms, rituals, fortune-tellers, even prayers whispered in candlelit rooms, but none of it gave her peace. The war had come, and with it, the looming certainty that her beloved son would be sent to die. Italy, under Mussolini, was a place of fear, rationing, and sacrifice. In Correggio, the small town where Leonarda lived, neighbors gossiped over shortages of bread and soap, while the shadow of war crept closer. Men were drafted, families torn apart. For mothers, the dread was unbearable. But for Leonarda, dread became obsession. She began consulting fortune-tellers with greater urgency, demanding answers, desperate for reassurance. One warned her that her children would all die. Yet another told her that the only way to save Giuseppe was through a sacrifice greater than any prayer. To most, such words would have been shrugged off as superstition. But Leonarda was not most. With her history of trauma, her years of loss, and her belief in her mother's curse, she absorbed the warning like it was divine law. In her mind, there was only one conclusion. Life required balance. If she wanted fate to spare her son, then fate must be fed. And what could possibly be enough to satisfy such a cruel force? Not an anima, not a symbolic offering. It had to be human. The thought horrified her at first, but it did not leave. It returned night after night, growing louder with every beat of her heart. She convinced herself it was not murder. It was protection. Not cruelty, but necessity. And slowly, her fear gave way to planning. Leonarda was not reckless. She understood she couldn't simply take a life without raising suspicion. But her years as a fortune-teller and wise woman in Correggio gave her a unique power. Women often came to her for advice, for charms, for help in solving their problems. To them, Leonarda was a trusted neighbor, almost a healer. And she saw, in that trust, the perfect cover. She began to look at her neighbors differently. Every lonely woman, every desperate soul who confided in her, became more than just a client. They became potential sacrifices. She studied their vulnerabilities, their needs, and her mind twisted them into opportunities. She wasn't hunting at random. She was choosing carefully, methodically, and all the while, she wrapped her darkest intentions in the language of love. "I am a mother protecting her child," she whispered to herself. Every mother would do the same if they could. The line between devotion and madness had shattered. In her eyes, Giuseppe's safety was worth anything, even blood. Especially blood. And so, in 1939, with war tightening its grip and her paranoia burning brighter than ever, Leonarda Cianciulli prepared for her first sacrifice. She had chosen a victim, but the horror she unleashed would not stop there. In September 1939, the world was already on the brink of destruction. Hitler had invaded Poland. Mussolini was stirring Italy into war, and in the quiet town of Correggio, a widow named Faustina Setti dreamed of love. She was older, lonely, and deeply vulnerable. The kind of woman who longed for companionship, who trusted to isolate when hope was dangled before her. And Leonarda Cianciulli knew it. Faustina often visited Leonarda, confiding in her like a friend. She wanted a husband, someone to care for her, someone to end the long silence of her nights. Leonarda listened patiently, nodding with the warm smile of a confidant. But behind those eyes, her mind was already working. She would give Faustina what she wanted most. Not love, not a husband, but a cruel illusion that would lead her directly into the jaws of death. Leonarda told Faustina she had arranged a marriage for her. A respectable man, wealthy and kind, waiting in a nearby town. All Faustina had to do was prepare for her journey. Leonarda even instructed her to write letters to relatives, explaining her sudden departure so no one would worry when she disappeared. Faustina, blinded by trust, followed every step as though guided by destiny. On the day of her departure, she came to Leonarda's home. She was expecting celebration, perhaps even blessings for her new life. Instead, Leonarda greeted her with a warm smile, offered her a glass of wine, and guided her into a private room. That drink, like so many in history's darkest murders, was laced with poison. Faustina grew weak, air had spun, the world around her blurred, and when she could no longer resist, Leonarda struck. With a single brutal blow from an axe, Faustina's life ended. The room was quiet again, but for Leonarda, this was not the end. It was only the beginning. She dragged Faustina's body to a basin. Methodically, with a disturbing calm, she cut the corpse into pieces. Her diary later described the process in chilling detail. How she boiled the flesh until it dissolved into thick, dark liquid. From that liquid, she made soap. She molded the fat into bars, hard and pale, and used them for her home. She even shared them with neighbors, who unknowingly bathed with the remains of Faustina Cetti. But Leonarda didn't stop there. She baked using blood mixed with flour and sugar. She made tea cakes. She served them with coffee, offering them to visitors with a smile. And yes, she ate them herself. Each bite, each bar of soap became more than sustenance. For her, it was ritual. It was sacrifice. It was protection for her son Giuseppe. Later, she would describe it without remorse. Almost proudly, the entire pot of flesh I poured into a basin and waited until it coagulated. I dried it in the oven, ground it, and mixed it with flour, sugar, chocolate, milk, and eggs. Then I made cakes. But the soap was the most beautiful. The neighbors used it, too. To Leonarda, Faustina was not a victim. She was an offering, a necessary price to be paid so Giuseppe would be spared from war's cruel hand. And when Faustina's family wondered where she had gone, Leonarda simply handed them the letters she had made her write. Letters that told of her happiness, her sudden new life, letters that silenced suspicion. For now Faustina Cetti had vanished. Her family would never see her again, and Leonarda Cianciulli, the devoted mother-turned-butcher, felt a grim satisfaction. She believed the sacrifice had worked. She believed Giuseppe was safe. But obsession rarely ends with one victim. For Leonarda, the hunger, the certainty that more blood was required, only grew stronger. The first time Leonarda Cianciulli told herself it was necessary. Faustina Cetti had been a sacrifice, a tragic but essential exchange to shield her beloved Giuseppe from the shadow of death. But as days turned to weeks, a new thought began to creep into her mind. What if one life wasn't enough? What if fate, or the curse she had carried since childhood, demanded more blood to be satisfied? It was a dangerous logic, born out of desperation and twisted by superstition. And slowly, it hardened into obsession. By 1940, the war had reached Italy's doorstep. Fear was in the air, rationing had begun, and families whispered prayers for their sons who were being drafted. Leonarda watched Giuseppe with the protective terror of a mother who could not let go. Every time he left the house, every time she heard rumors of casualties, her conviction deepened. She had to keep sacrificing. It was the only way. Her next target was Francesca Sovi, a schoolteacher, respected but lonely, looking for work. In Correggio, opportunities were scarce, but Leonarda, with her charm and reputation for helping others, seemed like a savior. She told Francesca of a position waiting for her in Piacenza, a teaching job, respectable and promising, that would change her life. Francesca, like Faustina before her, was told to keep it a secret, to write letters to friends and family explaining her departure, her happiness, her fortune. It was all carefully planned. On September 5th, 1940, Francesca arrived at Leonarda's home, expecting to be prepared for her journey. Instead, she was offered a drink, a welcoming toast to her new chapter, and once again, the poison flowed silently into her veins. As Francesca weakened, Leonarda acted with the precision of someone repeating a ritual. The axe, the basin, the boiling pot. The same gruesome process carried out with chilling calm. Flesh cut into pieces, blood drained, saved, mixed. The body transformed from a human being into soap and pastries. Leonarda later described Francesca's fate with the same cold practicality as Faustina's. I threw the pieces into a pot, added 7 kilos of caustic soda, which I had bought to make soap, and stirred the whole mixture until the pieces dissolved into a thick, dark mush. When it had cooled, I poured it into molds and made soap. The cakes I made as before, but this time something shifted. The act no longer horrified Leonarda. It comforted her. She believed she was performing a sacred duty, a ritual offering that gave her control over a fate she could not otherwise stop. She wasn't just killing. She was creating, transforming bodies into objects that symbolized protection, purification, even nourishment. She handed out bars of soap to her neighbors, women who washed their hands and clothes without ever realizing what they held. She offered cakes to guests with a sweet smile, the rich flavor masking its horrific secret, and she ate them herself, as though consuming her victim gave her strength. The people of Correggio whispered about Leonarda as a generous, kind-hearted woman, always giving, always smiling. No one suspected the truth, that beneath her apron and motherly demeanor was a murderer who believed blood and flesh could bend destiny. But Leonarda's obsession didn't stop there. If 2 lives had protected Giuseppe, how much safer would he be with 3 or 4? Her mind was no longer questioning whether to kill again. It was certain that the curse would only stay quiet if she kept feeding it. And so, just weeks after Francesca vanished, Leonarda began looking for her next victim. By the autumn of 1940, Leonarda Cianciulli had convinced herself that the only way to keep her beloved son Giuseppe safe was through blood sacrifice. 2 women had already vanished, their lives boiled away in her kitchen under the guise of soap and pastries. But for Leonarda, this wasn't enough. The war was intensifying. The draft was looming heavier over her household, and her fear had grown into an unshakable obsession. If the curse was real, and in her mind, it always was, then only more blood could silence it. This time, her eyes turned toward Virginia Caciupo, a well-known woman in Correggio. Unlike her previous victims, Virginia was not poor, not desperate, not isolated. She was a former opera singer, a woman of wealth, refinement, and reputation. In a small town, she stood out elegant, respected, and connected. Choosing Virginia was bold, almost reckless. But in Leonarda's mind, it was perfect. If Giuseppe's safety demanded a greater offering, what better than a woman of standing? Leonarda lured her with promises that seemed irresistible. She told Virginia that she had arranged a position for her in Florence, a job as a secretary for a wealthy empress, one that would provide security and money during a time when the world outside was collapsing into chaos. Virginia was intrigued, and more importantly, she trusted Leonarda. After all, Leonarda had built a reputation for helping people, arranging opportunities, and being a generous neighbor. But beneath the welcoming smile, Leonarda's plan was already in motion. Just as with the others, she insisted Virginia tell no one. Letters were written, carefully scripted, to explain her sudden departure and happiness. These notes would be sent later, disguising her disappearance as a voluntary choice. On September 30th, 1940, Virginia entered Leonarda's home for the last time. She likely felt hopeful, maybe even relieved, believing her life was about to turn toward prosperity. Instead, she was greeted with the same deadly hospitality, a drink laced with poison, a conversation that quickly turned into silence, and then Leonarda's axe falling with cold precision. But Virginia's death was not like the others. For Leonarda, this was not just another sacrifice. It was the pinnacle of her ritual. She later admitted that Virginia's flesh was richer, more refined than the others. She described boiling her body down into a thick, creamy fat, which she molded into soap of the highest quality. Her pastries, made with Virginia's blood, she claimed, were sweeter, more delicate, and she served them proudly to her neighbors. The confidence Leonarda showed after this killing bordered on arrogance. Unlike with Faustina or Francesca, whose disappearances had barely rippled beyond their small circles, Virginia's absence was immediately noticed. She was known. She had family, friends, and admirers. People asked questions almost instantly. Where had Virginia gone? Why hadn't she contacted anyone herself? And why was Leonarda, of all people, suddenly distributing more soap and cakes than usual? What Leonarda failed to consider was that Virginia's sister would not be fooled. Suspicious of the sudden disappearance and unconvinced by the letters, she reported her concerns to the police. In a small town like Correggio, gossip traveled fast, and soon the authorities began connecting the dots. 3 women, all of whom had last been seen with Leonarda Cianciulli. 3 women who had vanished without trace. For the first time, the walls around Leonarda's secret life began to close in. But even then, Leonarda did not panic. She believed she had done nothing wrong, at least not in the moral sense. In her mind, she was a mother, not a monster. She had taken lives, yes, but only to save the one that mattered most, and that conviction gave her the strength to look suspicion straight in the eye. Without fear. What Leonarda did not realize was that Virginia's murder would be the beginning of her downfall, because when the police finally entered her home, they would discover not just rumors and suspicion, but the darkest evidence of all. The murder of Virginia Cacioppo was a turning point, and Leonarda Cianciulli sensed the shift. Her first 2 victims had disappeared with barely a whisper, women whose absence stirred little noise beyond their closest circles. But Virginia was different. She had a name, a voice, a presence in Correggio that could not simply vanish, unnoticed. It began with Virginia's sister. Almost immediately, she grew suspicious when her sister failed to return home or contact her. The letter Virginia was supposed to have written, explaining her sudden departure to Florence, felt odd, stiff, unnatural, as though the words weren't truly hers. And in a small town where everybody knew everybody, the fact that Leonarda had been the last to see Virginia alive did not go unnoticed. The whispers started. Neighbors spoke of strange smells drifting from Leonarda's home around the time Virginia vanished. Others noted how generous Leonarda had suddenly become with soap and cakes, pressing them into the hands of those around her. At first, people accepted them gratefully, a rare treat during wartime shortages. But now, under the shadow of Virginia's disappearance, those same gifts took on a sinister hue. The police, already under pressure to respond to the growing unease, paid Leonarda a visit. At first, she welcomed them with her usual composure, smiling, offering tea, presenting herself as the picture of respectability. But beneath that calm exterior, her home carried traces of horror. Investigators noticed her obsession with cleanliness, the tools in her kitchen that seemed out of place for ordinary domestic life, and the faint but lingering metallic smell that clung to the air. Soon, the inquiries became more direct. Why had 3 women, all of whom had been close to Leonarda, disappeared without trace? Why did their letters sound so similar, almost as if they were written by the same hand? And why had Leonarda herself grown defensive whenever the subject arose? Under mounting suspicion, Leonarda's mask began to crack. She was no longer dealing with vulnerable women who could be manipulated with promises of opportunity. She was facing the scrutiny of trained investigators, men who had seen enough to recognize when something was terribly wrong. The turning point came when police searched her property more thoroughly. They found her diaries, filled with detailed notes that hinted at her crimes, not outright confessions, but enough chilling detail to raise alarms. Names, dates, and references to our twisted rituals. These writings gave weight to the rumors, transforming suspicion into near certainty. When confronted, Leonarda did something no one expected. She didn't deny. She didn't beg. She didn't even attempt to craft another lie. Instead, she confessed, calmly, almost proudly. She admitted to killing Faustina Setti, Francesca Sovi, and Virginia Cianciulli. She described how she had boiled their bodies down into soap, how she had baked their blood into pastries, and how she had distributed them to neighbors without hesitation. Her explanations stunned even the most hardened officers. She had not killed for money, or pleasure, or revenge. She had killed to protect her son. To shield Giuseppe from the dangers of war, she had offered up the lives of others. And in her mind, this made her not a criminal, but a mother making the ultimate sacrifice. The investigators were horrified. One officer later admitted that her confession chilled him more than the crimes themselves, because she spoke of it without shame, without remorse, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She even corrected details in the police report to ensure they recorded her methods accurately. The town of Correggio reeled. The kindly neighbor who had handed out soap and cakes was revealed to be a woman who had crafted them from the bodies of her victims. The streets buzzed with gossip, fear, and disbelief. Mothers clutched their children closer. Families of the victims demanded justice. And yet, Leonarda herself seemed almost relieved. For years, she had lived under the shadow of curses, of loss, of the belief that fate itself demanded blood. Now, with her secrets laid bare, she appeared lighter, as though confession had freed her from a burden she no longer wished to carry. But freedom was not what awaited her. Instead, Leonarda Cianciulli was about to face judgment not just from her neighbors and investigators, but from the entire country. Her crimes would soon move from the whispers of Correggio to the courtroom, where her story would horrify the world. The year was 1946. The war had ended, Italy was rebuilding, and the country was hungry for stories that explained, or at least distracted from the chaos it had endured. What emerged from the small town of Correggio was not a tale of soldiers or politics, but of a middle-aged mother who had turned her kitchen into a slaughterhouse. When Leonarda Cianciulli walked into the courtroom, she didn't look like a monster. She wasn't wild-eyed or disheveled. She was composed, neatly dressed, carrying herself with a dignity that unsettled everyone who looked at her. The press dubbed her La Saponificatrice di Correggio, the Soap-Maker of Correggio, and her case became a sensation. At first, many couldn't believe the rumors. How could this woman, known for her friendliness and generosity, be capable of such unspeakable things? But as the trial unfolded, disbelief gave way to horror. From the very beginning, Leonarda refused to play the role of the timid, repentant defendant. Instead, she leaned into a story with chilling precision. She described the murders in detail, not with anger or shame, but with a kind of clinical pride. She corrected prosecutors when they misrepresented her methods. She elaborated on how she dismembered the bodies, how she boiled them down, and how she carefully transformed flesh into soap and pastries. When the court asked why, her answer was disturbingly simple: to protect her son. She explained her belief in curses, her consultations with fortune-tellers, and her conviction that human sacrifice would keep Giuseppe safe from death in the war. To her, it was not murder. It was maternal duty. At one point, she even quipped, "I gave the soap to neighbors and friends. I ate the cakes myself. They were quite good." The courtroom gasped. Some laughed nervously, unable to process the casual cruelty of her words. Others sat in stunned silence, revolted but unable to look away. The judges, hardened men who had presided over brutal wartime trials, admitted they had never heard testimony so grotesque or delivered with such calm certainty. The prosecution painted her as a calculating killer, someone who preyed on vulnerable women for financial gain. They pointed out that each victim had entrusted Leonarda with savings, valuables, or money before their disappearance. Her crimes, they argued, were not born from superstition, but from greed. Leonarda bristled at this. Again and again, she interrupted the proceedings to correct the narrative. "I did not kill for money," she insisted. "I killed out of love. Love for my son. You may not understand, but a mother's heart compels her to protect her child at any cost." This defense horrified the public even more. If love could justify butchery, what hope was there for understanding evil? Witnesses were called. Neighbors described the strange soap she handed out, the pastries that tasted oddly metallic. Survivors who had eaten them turned pale as they testified. Forensic experts confirmed that human remains had been found in her cauldrons and tools. The evidence was overwhelming. But even with her guilt laid bare, Leonarda seemed almost proud of her notoriety. She soaked in the attention, as though the trial itself had transformed her into a kind of dark legend. Where others might have begged for mercy, she seemed to revel in the spotlight, as if retelling her crimes allowed her to control the story one last time. In the end, the verdict was clear. Leonarda Cianciulli was sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. The court recognized both the brutality of her crimes and the disturbed mind that had justified them. As she was led away, she did not weep. She did not plead. She carried herself with the same unsettling calm she had shown from the start. For Leonarda, it seemed, there was no regret. Only the conviction that she had done what was necessary. However monstrous it appeared to others, Italy had its verdict, but the fascination with Leona did not fade. Her trial had become more than a case. It was a window into the darkest corners of human psychology, where love, superstition, and madness merged into horror. And yet, her story did not end there. Behind the prison walls, and later within the asylum, Leonarda lived out her final years, still convinced she had acted as a mother, not a murderer. Leonarda Cianciulli did not vanish into obscurity after her conviction. If anything, prison and the asylum gave her a darker kind of immortality. For decades after her arrest, the people of Correggio whispered her name like a curse. Mothers told their children never to wander alone, never to trust too quickly. In their warnings, Leonarda became less a woman and more a legend. The soap maker who turned people into cakes. In prison, Leonarda remained eerily composed. She was not the raving, violent inmate some expected. Instead, she spent much of her time writing. She kept journals, recording her memories and detailing her life with unsettling clarity. One of her writings, an autobiography titled Confessions of an Embittered Soul, offered a window into her psyche. In it, she recounted her belief in the curse, her devotion to her son, and her justification for the murders. To her, it all still made sense. The line between love and horror had blurred so deeply that she could no longer see it. After serving her prison term, she was transferred to the asylum for the criminally insane, where she would remain until her death. Even there, she carried herself like a woman, certain she had done nothing wrong. Nurses and doctors who encountered her described her as polite, even charming at times. But beneath her surface calm lay the chilling fact. She had boiled human flesh into soap and fed it to her neighbors. On October 15th, 1970, Leonarda Cianciulli died in the asylum at the age of 76. Her body was laid to rest quietly, but her legacy was anything but silent. Objects from her crimes, her cauldrons, tools, and diaries were preserved and can still be found today in Italy's Criminological Museum in Rome. Visitors stare in horrified fascination at the very pot she once used to render her victims into soap, a relic that bridges the line between history and nightmare. What makes Leonarda's story so haunting is not just the brutality of her acts, but the why behind them. She was not a cold-blooded killer seeking thrills. She was not a sadist, in the traditional sense. She was a mother who believed she was cursed, who convinced herself that blood sacrifice was the only way to save her child. In her mind, she was a protector, even as she destroyed innocent lives. Her crimes force us to confront a terrifying question. How far can love be twisted before it becomes something monstrous? Leonarda's case is a chilling reminder that sometimes evil wears the face of devotion. Today, her name remains one of the darkest chapters in Italy's criminal history. She is remembered not just as a murderer, but as a symbol of how superstition, trauma, and obsession can fuse into horrors beyond imagination. Her story sits on the edge of folklore and reality, where fact feels stranger than fiction. And yet, perhaps the most disturbing detail of all is this. For years, neighbors unknowingly scrubbed their skin with soap made from human remains. They ate cakes baked with blood. The memory of that reality lingers, a grotesque reminder that Leonarda Cianciulli didn't just kill her victims. She made them part of her community. Her death closed the final chapter of her life, but her legacy endures, whispered in true crime circles and immortalized in history books. The Soap-Maker of Correggio remains proof that the darkest nightmares are not found in legends or stories, but in the quiet kitchens of ordinary homes.